call came at 2:37 in the morning, and I knew before I even picked up the phone that something had gone very wrong. My younger brother, I'll call him Art because that's what everyone called him, short for Arthur, was not the kind of man who called anyone at 2:37 in the morning. He was the steady one, the responsible one, the one who said birthday cards on time and showed up early to things. When we were boys growing up in Dayton, Ohio, people would look at the two of us and immediately know which one was which. Art was the one with the iron collar. I was the one with the grass stains on my knees and a smart remark ready to go. So when his number lit up my phone in the dark, something cold moved through my chest. I answered. There was a long pause. Then his voice came through, quiet, flat, like all the air had been pressed out of him. I fell, he said. He hadn't fallen. I drove 4 hours through the night to get to the hospital in Columbus where they'd taken him. By the time I got there, the sun was just starting to come up, that thin gray light that makes everything look fragile. A nurse led me down a hallway and into a room where my brother was lying in a bed with his left arm in a cast, 2 broken ribs, a deep bruise running along the left side of his face, and a cut above his eye that had been stitched closed. I stood at the foot of that bed for a long moment without saying anything. I'm 64 years old. I spent 22 years in the Army, including 2 tours that I don't talk about much at dinner parties. I have seen things that permanently altered the way I understand human beings. I'm not, by most measures, an emotional man. But looking at my brother in that bed, I felt something ignite in the center of my chest that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Art, I said, who did this to you? He looked at the window. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I told you, he said. I fell. He hadn't fallen off anything. I knew it. He knew I knew it. The bruising pattern was wrong. The cut above his eye was wrong. 22 years in the military teaches you a few things about the difference between an injury and a beating, and my brother had been beaten. It took me until the second day to get the truth out of him, and when it came in pieces, like he was ashamed of every single one of them. His son-in-law's name was Preston. Art had been widowed about 6 years prior. My sister-in-law passed from ovarian cancer, and it hit him hard, harder than most people knew. He'd sold the house he and my sister-in-law had shared in Worthington and moved into the guest suite of his daughter's home in New Albany, one of those newer developments east of Columbus where all the houses look like they were designed by the same committee. His daughter, I'll call her Lena, had married Preston about 3 years before my sister-in-law died. At the time, Art had liked the man well enough. Preston was charming in that polished, surface-level way that certain kinds of men are charming. He had good posture and a firm handshake, and he knew how to hold a wine glass at a party. What Art hadn't known, what none of us had known, was what Preston was like behind closed doors. It started small, the way these things always start small. Preston began making comments at dinner about how much Art ate, then about how often Art used the car, then about the cost of Art's medications. Art has a heart condition that requires a daily regimen, nothing exotic, just standard management drugs, but the prescriptions needed to be filled monthly. Preston had offered to handle the family finances when Lena went back to work part-time, and somehow that offer had turned into complete control. The credit cards were in Preston's name. The household accounts were in Preston's name. Art's pension checks were deposited into a joint account that Preston managed. Art had no cash, no cards, no way to pay for anything independently. When he'd tried to talk to Lena about it, she'd cried and said Preston was just trying to help, that things were stressful right now, that Art just needed to give it a little more time. Lena was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that, but she was a woman who had learned somewhere along the way that peace was more valuable than truth, and she had been choosing peace for so long she couldn't see what it had cost her father. The falling had happened because Art asked politely, my brother was always polite, whether he could have some cash to buy his own medication refill that week. Preston had said no. Art had asked why, and Preston had grabbed him by the front of his shirt, dragged him into the hallway, and shoved him hard enough into the wall that Art had gone down. He'd hit his face on the corner of a side table on the way. He was 71 years old. I sat there in that hospital chair, listening to my brother tell this story in his quiet, flattened voice, and I did not say anything for a very long time. I looked at my hands in my lap. I breathed slowly. I did the thing I learned to do in the military when the anger gets big. I let it go quiet inside me, let it settle into something cold and purposeful instead of hot and chaotic. When I finally spoke, I asked Art one question. Would you let me help you? He looked at me then, finally, for the first time since I'd walked in. His eyes were tired and a little ashamed, and underneath all of that, there was something else. Something that looked a lot like relief. He said, yes. The plan was not complicated. It did not need to be. Art and I are fraternal twins. We're not identical in the strict genetic sense, but we're close enough. Same height within a half-inch, same broad build, same gray hair, same general pattern to our faces. We'd fooled people our whole lives when we wanted to. In 6th grade, we'd switched classes for an entire week before anyone caught on. In our 30s, at a cousin's wedding, we'd swapped name tags at the rehearsal dinner and kept it going through the entire reception. It was the kind of thing brothers do when they've known each other long enough. The difference now was that the stakes were somewhat higher than a rehearsal dinner. Art was going to stay with a friend of mine in Dayton, a retired MP who I trusted completely and who asked no questions beyond, for how long, while I went to New Albany to be Art. I drove out on a Thursday afternoon. I'd borrowed Art's reading glasses. I'd studied the way he held his shoulders, a little more rounded than mine. Art had never quite shaken a habit of making himself smaller in rooms, which told you a lot about the last few years of his life. I wore his cardigan. I drove his car. The house was a 5-bedroom colonial with a 3-car garage and a landscaped front yard that someone was clearly paying good money to maintain. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment looking at it. Nice house, the kind of house that looked from the outside like everything inside it was fine. Lena met me at the door. She was surprised. Art hadn't told her he was being discharged that day because the timing of my arrival had been a detail we'd deliberately kept loose. She looked at my cast. I had borrowed Art's on the arm that didn't have a fracture and just rewrapped it. I know, not exactly medically sound, but it was temporary. And her face did something complicated. Guilt. Relief. A little bit of something that might have been the beginning of the thought she wasn't letting herself finish. Dad, she said, you should have called. I would have come to get you. I'm fine, I said. I'm all right. She hugged me carefully, avoiding the arm, and I patted her back and reminded myself that this woman was not the enemy. She was a person who had gotten lost somewhere, and part of why I was here was for her, too. Preston wasn't home yet. He came in around 7, suit jacket over his arm, already looking like a man who expected the evening to go his way. He stopped when he saw me sitting at the kitchen table. There was a half-second, a fraction of a moment, where I watched him recalibrate. He'd been expecting Art. He was looking at Art, but something in the way I was sitting maybe, or something in the way I looked back at him, gave him a half-second of unease that he smoothed over quickly. You're back, he said. Not a question. Not particularly warm. I'm back, I said. He nodded slowly, set his jacket on the back of a chair, and went to pour himself a drink without asking whether anyone else wanted one. That first week I watched. That was all. I watched the way Preston moved through that house, the way he positioned himself at the head of every conversation, the way he redirected Lena mid-sentence when she said something he didn't want said, the way he made small comments that were just pointed enough to land, but deniable enough that you couldn't quite call them out directly. He was skilled at it. He'd been doing it a long time. He tested me on the 3rd day. He came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and said very casually that he'd noticed the medication bottles in the bathroom cabinet were almost empty. I'll need to refill those soon, I said, keeping my voice neutral. I'll take care of it, he said. That's all right, I said. I can call the pharmacy myself. The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. Preston looked at me. I looked at the coffee pot. Art, he said, we've talked about this. We can talk about it again, I said pleasantly. He left the kitchen without another word. I heard him on the phone with someone in the hallway, voice low and tight. I poured my coffee and added a splash of the half and half that Art liked. I'd made a note of it. And I thought about patience. I have always been good at patience when it matters. The medication situation was the first thing I addressed, and I addressed it unilaterally. I drove to the CVS on Main Street, paid for Art's refills out of my own pocket. The amount was not insignificant, but that is what older brothers are for, and brought them home. When Preston saw the pharmacy bag on the counter that evening, something moved across his face that was not quite anger and not quite fear. It was the expression of a man who has been in control of something for a long time and has just noticed that the control might be slipping. Good, I wanted him to notice. The following Tuesday, Preston came home from work in a foul mood. I don't know what happened at his office. I didn't particularly care, but he came in loud and sharp-edged and looking for something to push against. He found it in the form of a comment I made at dinner about wanting to look into having my name added back to one of the household accounts. I said it mildly, the way Art would have said it. I said I'd been thinking it might simplify things. Preston put down his fork. "We've been through this," he said. "The accountant set it up this way for a reason." "I'd like to talk to the accountant then," I said, directly. "That's not necessary." "I think it might be." Lena was very still across the table. She was looking at her plate. Preston stood up. He was a tall man, and he used his height the way certain men do, as a physical argument. He came around the table toward me, and I watched him come, and I sat very still in my chair, and I looked at him with an expression that I have been told, on more than one occasion, is somewhat unsettling to people who are used to getting their way. He stopped about 3 feet from me. Something shifted in his face. I'm not sure what he saw in mine, but whatever it was not what he had been expecting. He was expecting the Art he knew, the man who flinched, who apologized, who made himself small. He was not expecting whatever I was giving him instead. He went back to his seat. He picked up his fork. He said something to Lena about a work dinner later in the week, changing the subject with the smooth ease of a man who has changed many subjects. But his hand, I noticed, was not entirely steady on the fork. The next thing I did was call Art's attorney. Art had a lawyer in Columbus, a woman he'd worked with when he sold his house after my sister-in-law died. I called her from the car, parked 2 blocks from the house, and explained the situation as clearly and concisely as I could. She listened without interrupting, which is the mark of a good attorney. "He needs to formally revoke Preston's financial authority," she said when I finished. "And he needs to be the one to do it in person in front of me. When can he come in?" "Give me a week," I said. I also called a social worker at an elder care organization in Columbus. Not to file anything formal, not yet, but to understand what documentation we'd need and what our options were if things escalated. The social worker was matter-of-fact and kind and gave me a list of steps that I wrote down in a small notebook I'd started keeping in my jacket pocket. I was not just waiting for Preston to behave badly again. I was building something. He obliged me with the behaving badly sooner than I expected. On a Friday evening, about 9 days into my time in that house, Lena drove over to her friend's place for a birthday dinner. Her friend's 40th, something she'd had on the calendar for weeks. It was the first time she'd left the house for a social occasion in, as far as I could tell, quite a while. Preston had made some comment that morning about whether she really needed to go, whether it was a good time, whether she'd be too tired. She'd gone anyway. I was glad. Which left Preston and me alone in the house. He started in around 8 o'clock. I was in the sitting room reading. Art had left a novel on the side table, and I'd picked it up. I have it. When Preston came in with a drink and sat down across from me and started talking. He was not technically threatening me. He was talking about the future, about how the house worked, about how arrangements needed to stay as they were for everyone's benefit. He talked for a long time in this careful, patient way that was clearly designed to make me feel small and confused and aware of how dependent I was on his goodwill. When he finished, I set down the book. "Preston," I said, "I want to be very direct with you." He blinked. "I've spoken with an attorney," I said. "I've also been in contact with an elder financial abuse specialist at a nonprofit here in Columbus. Next week, I am going to that attorney's office in person, and I am going to revoke every financial arrangement that currently runs through you. I am going to have my pension redirected to my own account. I am going to have my name placed on a new account that only I control. And if you interfere with that process in any way, physically, verbally, financially, I will file a formal complaint with the Columbus Police Department and Adult Protective Services, and I will provide them with the documentation I have already begun collecting." The room was very quiet. Preston's jaw was tight. His eyes had gone flat in a way that told me the charm was completely off now, fully retracted, and what was underneath was not charming at all. He stood up. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I said. I didn't raise my voice. "And I think, on some level, you've known since the night I came back from the hospital that something was different. So I'll tell you plainly. I'm not afraid of you. I have never been afraid of you. and I will never again be the man who fell against that wall in the hallway and didn't do anything about it." He stared at me for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated, processing, recalibrating, trying to figure out what had changed and whether he could reverse it. He left the room. I sat with the novel in my lap for a few minutes, listening to him move around upstairs. Then I picked up my phone and texted my friend in Dayton. Time to bring him home. My brother came back to Columbus on a Wednesday. Lena didn't know. I had asked Art to trust me on the timing, and he had, because Art has always trusted me more than I probably deserved. The attorney's appointment was set for Thursday morning. The plan was for Art to walk into that house on Wednesday evening and for things to be effectively over before Preston understood what was happening. It did not go exactly that smoothly. Things rarely do. Preston was home when Art walked through the front door. Lena was in the kitchen. I was standing in the hallway, and I watched my brother's face when he came in. The slight straightening of his spine, the way his eyes moved around the house he'd been living in for the last 3 years. Something in his expression had changed since the last time I'd seen him in that hospital bed. He looked less like a man who had learned to make himself small. He still looked tired, but he looked like himself. Preston came out of the study when he heard the door, and he stopped cold in the hallway. He looked at Art. He looked at me. He looked at Art again. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it was the kind of silence that contains a very large amount of information. "Hello, Preston," Art said. His voice was quiet and steady. Lena came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and stopped when she saw us both. Her face went through several things very quickly: confusion, recognition, and then, and this was the moment that mattered, something cracked open in it. She looked at her father. She looked at her husband. She looked at me. And she started to cry. Not the kind of crying that is asking for something. The kind of crying that comes when a person has been not seeing something for a long time, and then suddenly they see it all at once. I gave her a minute. Then I said gently, "Lena, your dad needs to talk to you." Preston tried to take control of the room. He was good at it, and he started talking about misunderstandings, about how Art hadn't been well, about how this was a private family matter that didn't need outside involvement. He was smooth and he was practiced, and under different circumstances he might have managed it. But my brother was standing in his own hallway, and I was standing next to him, and Lena was standing there with her dish towel and her cracked open face, and Preston looked at the three of us and seemed to realize for the first time that the room had shifted in a way he couldn't talk his way back from. "I think," Art said quietly, "you should call the attorney. Tonight." Preston didn't say anything. "If you don't," Art said, "I will." The attorney's appointment happened on Thursday, as scheduled. Art sat across from his lawyer in her office on High Street and formally revoked Preston's power of attorney and his authority over every joint account. The pension redirect took a few days to process, but it was filed that morning. A new individual account in Art's name was opened at a credit union 2 miles from the house. The attorney who, I noticed, did not appear remotely surprised by any of what Art told her, referred us to a colleague who handled elder financial abuse cases, and that colleague filed a formal complaint with the appropriate county office before the end of the week. Preston did not take it quietly. There were several very unpleasant conversations over the following days, 2 of which I was present for and 1 of which I was not. He made threats that were vague enough to be deniable. He used words with Lena that I won't repeat here. He moved out on a Saturday, took his clothes and his golf clubs, and left the rest, which struck me as very revealing about what he actually valued. Lena filed for divorce 6 weeks later. She called Art from the attorney's office to tell him, and when he told me about it afterward, he said she'd cried on the phone and said she was sorry. He said he'd told her there was nothing to be sorry for. That's my brother, 71 years old, 2 broken ribs, and still the one with the ironed collar. I stayed in Columbus for about 3 weeks total before driving back to Dayton. On the last morning, Art and I sat at his kitchen table in his house with his coffee, and we didn't talk much. We'd said most of what needed to be said over the previous weeks, in pieces the way we'd always communicated, 2 men who came from a generation not given to long declarations. He poured me a second cup without asking. I drank it without commenting on the half and half. "You look different," I told him after a while. He thought about that. "I feel different," he said. I nodded. Outside the kitchen window, a cardinal was doing something in the yard. We watched it for a minute. "You could have called me sooner," I said. not as an accusation, just as a fact. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was ashamed. I didn't argue with that. I understood it. Men of our generation carry shame in a very particular way. About needing help, about being vulnerable, about being in situations that seem, from the outside, like something that should have been handled sooner or better or differently. I've felt versions of it myself over the years. It doesn't make you weak, it just makes you human. Don't be ashamed next time, I said. He gave a small, dry laugh. Let's hope there isn't a next time. Let's hope, I agreed. We shook hands in the driveway when I left, because that's how we've always done it. Then he pulled me in for a brief, hard hug, the way men who don't hug easily hug when they mean it. I drove back to Dayton through the flat Ohio farmland, windows down, radio low. I was tired in the way you get tired after something that required sustained, careful attention over a long period of time. Not exhausted, just quieted, settled. I am 64 years old. I have 2 adult children of my own, and a house that needs a new roof, and a doctor who keeps telling me to eat less red meat, and I do not particularly enjoy being away from my own bed for 3 weeks. I am not, as I said, a naturally dramatic person. But my brother is back in his own home, with his own money, with his medication filled and his name on his own accounts, and nobody standing between him and his own life. His daughter is figuring out who she is without a man telling her who that should be. And somewhere on the other side of Columbus, a man named Preston is learning, perhaps for the first time, that control has a shelf life. That's enough for me. Some people have asked, the few I've told this story to, whether I feel any guilt about the deception, about pretending to be my brother for nearly 3 weeks, about looking Preston in the face every day and letting him think he was dealing with the man he'd been bullying. I've thought about it. I have. No, I don't. I feel like a brother, which, if you've done it right, is the better thing to be. I keep coming back to the moment Art walked through that front door in New Albany. The way his spine straightened just a little. The way his eyes moved around the house like he was relearning that it was supposed to belong to him. That image stays with me. It tells me everything I need to know about what 3 years under Preston's roof had done to my brother, and what it cost him to walk back in and reclaim what was his. What Preston did was not complicated. That's the part people miss when they hear a story like this. They imagine something elaborate, some criminal genius. But what Preston did was simple. He found a man who was grieving, who was lonely, who had been raised, like most men of our generation, to equate asking for help with weakness. And he positioned himself as the solution. He made himself indispensable. He made himself necessary. And then, once he was woven into the fabric of my brother's daily life, he pulled the threads one at a time until there was very little left. That is how control actually works, not all at once, slowly, quietly, in a direction that is almost impossible to see when you are the one standing inside it. Art did nothing wrong. I want to say that plainly. He trusted his daughter. He trusted the man she married. He tried to keep peace in a house where peace kept being used as a weapon against him. None of that was weakness. It was decency. And decency, when it meets a certain kind of cruelty, can look, from the outside, like passivity. It isn't. It's just decency being treated worse than it deserves. What I did, walking into that house, sitting across the table from Preston, looking him in the eye day after day, required something I wasn't sure I still had after all these years. Not courage exactly. More like clarity. The ability to see a situation for what it actually is without flinching from it, without softening it into something more comfortable. That clarity is something I had to work for. It came from 22 years of being put in situations where the cost of not seeing clearly was higher than the cost of seeing something hard. Not everyone gets that kind of training, but I think everyone is capable of it, if they're willing to sit with discomfort long enough to understand what they're actually looking at. What I think about most now, driving back through that flat Ohio farmland in my memory, is Lena, standing in the doorway with her dish towel, the thing that broke open in her face when she saw us both. She had not been a villain. She had been a person who chose comfort over truth for so long that she forgot she was choosing. That happens. It happens to good people. The question is whether something eventually cracks it open, whether the moment comes where the cost of not seeing becomes higher than the cost of seeing. Her moment came. She rose to it. That is the thing about character. The real kind, not the kind people perform at dinner parties. It doesn't announce itself in advance. It shows up in the moments when the easier thing and the right thing point in different directions, and you have to decide which road you're on. Art showed it when he finally said, "Yes, let me help you." Lena showed it when she picked up that phone and called the attorney. I like to think I showed some version of it every morning I sat at that kitchen table and held my ground without losing myself in the process. Preston showed his character too in the end, just not the kind anyone would want to claim. I don't know exactly what the future holds for Art. He has his accounts back. He has his medications. He has a kitchen that is his. That is enough for now. The rest he will figure out one day at a time, the way all of us do after something that took more from us than it had any right to take. What I know is this: nobody gets to take what belongs to someone else and walk away unchanged. Not because the universe is keeping score in any mystical sense, just because actions compound. Choices build on choices. The man who takes and takes eventually finds himself in a room where there is nothing left to take and nobody left who trusts him. And that room is the one he built himself, one quiet, calculated decision at a time. And the man who drives 4 hours through the dark to sit with his brother, that man gets a second cup of coffee in the morning, poured without asking, in a kitchen that finally feels like home again. That's enough. That has always been enough.